The words reached her from the other side of the drawing room door, carried through old oak the way voices always carried in Ashmore Hall, perfectly, and always to the wrong ears. The woman has no more claim on his Grace's attention than the hall boy has on the chandelier. Less, if we are being honest. At least the boy is useful. Marion Voss did not move. She had learned, over 4 years of service in this house, that stillness was its own kind of armor. She stood with the accounts ledger pressed flat against her chest, the brass clasp cold through the wool of her sleeve, and she counted the 7 paces to the drawing room door, and the 4 paces back to the stairwell, and she chose the stairwell. She always chose the stairwell. She did not yet know that this particular morning, the 12th of June, with the roses blowing sideways in a wind off the moor and Parliament sitting in 10 days, and every document she had spent 3 months reconstructing now resting between her hands, was the last morning she would ever have the luxury of that choice. Had she known, she would have made it all the same. She had not survived 4 years at Ashmore Hall by flinching, and she was not going to begin now. The morning had begun badly, which at Ashmore Hall meant it had begun precisely like every other morning. The post had arrived with a notice from the Duchy's solicitor, addressed to the Duke of Ashmore himself, and since the Duke was in the habit of arriving at his own estate the way Weather arrived, without announcement and at great inconvenience, it had fallen to Marion, as it invariably fell to Marion, to receive the notice, to read it with the practiced expression of someone reading about crop rotation, and to understand that it meant the estate's accounts were being formally reviewed by the Duchy's Board of Trustees in 10 days' time. 10 days. Not a season, not a month. 10 days, and the accounts she had been silently, systematically rebuilding from corrupted ledgers for the past 8 weeks were not yet finished. She went to her room, set the ledger on the writing desk, opened it to the page she had marked with a strip of linen, and began to work. She was still working when the knock came. It was not the tentative knock of a housemaid, nor the brisk knock of Mrs. Ferris, the housekeeper. It was the knock of a person who had never in their life considered that a door might not open for them. Marion set down her pen. The Duke of Ashmore filled the doorway in the way large. Still, men fill doorways, not by taking up space aggressively, but by making the space suddenly aware of its own smallness. He was travel-dusty, his coat dark with the morning's damp, and his hands, which were, as the estate's head groom had once observed with some confusion, not the hands of a duke at all, but the hands of someone who had spent considerable time doing something with rope or timber, were bare. He looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her again. "Miss Voss, Your Grace." She did not rise. She had spent considerable thought on this, in the weeks since she had understood who she was dealing with and what she was doing for him without his knowing, and she had concluded that rising would suggest she had been caught at something. She had not been caught at anything. She had been working. His gaze moved to the open ledger. What is that? It was not a question. Marion had noticed he rarely asked questions in the conventional grammatical sense. He made statements of inquiry and expected the world to answer them, and the world, having seen his face, generally did. "Your accounts," she said, "the 3rd and 4th ledger years. I have been reconstructing them." Something in his face went very still in a way that was distinct from his ordinary stillness. "Reconstructing. The originals were corrupted. I assumed you were aware." He was not aware. She could see it, the almost imperceptible recalibration behind his eyes, the slight adjustment of a man who has just discovered that the ground he assumed was solid has been, for some time, a thin crust over water. He covered it quickly. He was very good at covering things. Who authorized this work? No one. That is why it needed doing. The silence that followed had a particular texture. Marian had learned to read silences the way her father, who had been a solicitor's clerk before his ruin, had taught her to read documents, not for what they contained, but for what they withheld. "You have been in my employ for 4 years," the Duke said at last, "as a companion to my aunt. Your aunt died 14 months ago. Since then, I have been in your employ as an accountant, by default, without the title or the wage. I have not raised the matter because the work wanted doing and there was no one else to do it, and because, Your Grace, I think you will find that most problems in this house have exactly that shape." She returned her attention to the ledger. "Your solicitor sent notice this morning, 10 days to the board review. I expect I will have the reconstruction finished in 8, which gives you 2 days to look it over before you walk into that room." The silence this time was different. Marian did not look up. "What?" said the Duke of Ashmore, in a voice that had gone quiet in the particular way of voices that are dangerous when they go quiet. "Did you find?" She laid her pen down with great precision, corner to corner against the ledger's spine. "I think," she said, "that we should not speak of it in a doorway." He stepped inside. He closed the door. The name of the man Marian did not yet know she was exposing was Mr. Crispin Vane, and he arrived at Ashmore Hall that same evening in a carriage that was, by some small margin, too fine for a steward's salary, though no one in the hall had ever remarked on it. He was 34, immaculate in dark wool, with the sort of pale, symmetrical face that made strangers inclined to trust him, and a voice that seemed to have been engineered specifically to remain pleasant under conditions that should have made it rise. He had been the Duke's steward for 6 years. He had been the Duke's cousin's steward before that. The hall liked him, with the general, slightly nervous affection one extends to something beautiful that might bite. Mrs. Ferris, the housekeeper, reported his arrival to Marian with the particular expression of a woman delivering news she has correctly guessed will not be welcome. "He's asking after the accounts, miss, wants to know where the 3rd ledger year is filed." "Tell him it's in use," Marian said, without looking up. Mrs. Ferris looked at the closed door between Marian's small room and the Duke's study, where the Duke had been for the past 2 hours with the pages Marian had produced for him, and she said nothing, and went away. He came to find Marian himself an hour after dinner. She was in the estate office, a narrow, lamp-lit room off the east corridor that smelled of dust and old ink and the faint mineral ghost of the moor coming through the ill-fitted window, when the door opened and Crispin Vane stood in it, and he was smiling, which was how she knew the conversation was going to be unpleasant. "Miss Voss," his voice had the quality of silk laid over something inflexible. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all." She did not set down her pen. He came in. He looked at the desk, the orderly stacks, the columns, the linen marker, and his smile did not change, but something behind it did, some faint recalculation too brief to name. "I understand you have been making yourself indispensable. I have been making myself useful. It is not the same thing, is it not?" He picked up the corner of a page, not the one she was working on, a ledger copy, a neutral thing, and set it down again. "His Grace has been away a great deal. The estate has required management. I should perhaps have been more attentive to Miss Voss's involvement before now." A pause, gentle as a blade. You were Lady Ashmore's companion, yes, before her passing?" "Yes, a position of some domestic intimacy. She was unwell. She needed someone to read to her and to manage her correspondence and to see that her medicines were properly dispensed. I did those things." She said it plainly, without invitation for comment. Her medicines. His pause was so brief she almost missed it. "You were careful, I hope, with the dispensing." Marian set down her pen. She looked at him for the first time in the conversation, and she kept her face entirely still, the way her father had taught her. You cannot afford to give them the tell. Marian, you are cleverer than them, but they must not suspect it. Scrupulously, she said. He smiled again. Of course. Well, I shan't disturb your work. Only, if you find anything in the old ledgers that confuses you, I hope you will bring it to me first, before troubling His Grace. These things have context, you see, that a person without the full history of the estate might easily misread. She picked up her pen. How thoughtful. He left. Marian sat in the lamplight for a long moment after the door closed, listening to his footsteps recede down the corridor. Then she looked at the small locked drawer on the left side of the estate desk, the one she had found 6 weeks ago, to contain not account copies but something else entirely, a thing she had locked back inside and told no one about because she had not yet understood what it meant, and because she had not yet had reason to understand it. She was beginning to understand it now. The days that followed had the quality of a siege conducted in perfect civility. The Duke worked in his study. Marian worked in the estate office. Crispin Vane moved between them with that frictionless social grace that made every hallway conversation look like a courtesy call. He was never where he should not be. He was merely always present. He brought the Duke papers. He mentioned, in the course of one apparently careless breakfast exchange that Marian heard from the doorway, because the dining room door had been left ajar, a thing that later struck her as less accidental, that Miss Voss's reconstruction, while well-intentioned, might benefit from some cross-referencing with his own records, as there had been several unusual transactions in the relevant years that required context. What sort of transactions? The Duke said. Nothing alarming. Only, Miss Voss, I understand, was not yet with the household during the period in question, and there are certain family considerations, expenses, related to Lady Ashmore's care, for instance, that were handled with some delicacy and might read oddly to an outside eye. The Duke said nothing. That was his particular gift. He could say nothing in a way that filled a room. I mention it, Vane added, in his gentlest voice, only in the interest of discretion. Marian, in the doorway, did not move. She noted the word. Discretion. She filed it. She went directly from the doorway to the estate office, and she opened the locked drawer with the small iron key she had been carrying for 6 weeks sewn into the seam of her pocket, and she looked at what was inside for a long time. Then she relocked it, and she went to find Mrs. Ferris, the old housekeeping accounts, she said. The domestic records, before my time, where are they kept? Mrs. Ferris looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for some time to be asked a particular question. In the East Store, Miss, in 3 brown boxes. They've not been touched since Mr. Vane reorganized the archive, 3 years past. Has anyone asked for them? No, miss, not one soul. Marian found them in 40 minutes. She spent the next 14 hours with them, and with a candle, and with a piece of paper on which she wrote nothing down because she did not need to. Her father had given her a mind that held figures the way a well-cut stone holds an edge. And by the time the house was waking, she knew 3 things with the certainty of demonstrated fact. She knew what Crispin Vane had been doing for 6 years. She knew how Lady Ashmore had died. And she knew that the only document that could prove it absolutely was the one locked in the estate desk drawer, which Crispin Vane had been trying, in the smoothest and most civilized possible way, to find. She was in the great hall, returning from the East Store in the cold early gray, the candle dead, the brown boxes under her arm, when she walked directly into the Duke of Ashmore. He was in shirt-sleeves and looked as though he had not slept either. They stood in the gray light, looking at each other, and Marian thought, He knows something. Not what she knew. Not yet, but something had shifted in him in the past day, some careful equilibrium disturbed, and she could see it in the way he held his hands, not quite still, not quite not still. Miss Voss. Your Grace. He looked at the boxes. What are those? She held his gaze. The thing I cannot yet lay before you. Give me 2 more days. He could have demanded. He was the Duke of Ashmore. Demanding was well within his charter. Instead, he said, after a long moment, 2 days. 2 days, she said, and went upstairs and locked her door. She did not sleep that night. She finished the reconstruction instead, every figure in its column, every discrepancy notated, the pattern documented in 6 different ways, the way her father had shown her. Never one proof. Marion, they find a way around one proof, give them 6 and make them connected, and build it so the whole thing falls if any piece is false. By 4 in the morning, the document was done. By 5, the 3 brown boxes were stacked precisely in the corner, the locked drawer was still locked, and the ledger was closed. She looked at it for a long time. Then, she did something she had not done in 4 years at Ashmore Hall. She washed her face, changed her dress, pinned her hair with her mother's jet brooch, and went downstairs before the house was awake. She sat in the kitchen and drank tea with cook and the scullery maid, and she was, for the first time in recent memory, afraid, not of Crispin Vane, whose next move she could predict to within a sentence. Not of the Duke, whose silence she had learned to parse in 8 weeks better than most people parsed it in years. She was afraid of the cost. She knew what the next 24 hours would require of her, and she knew exactly what it would spend, and she sat in the warm kitchen with the smell of bread and the early light coming through the low window, and she counted the cost honestly, and she decided it was worth it. She was a solicitor's daughter. She had always known how to read a ledger. She went upstairs to find the Duke and hand him the completed reconstruction, and she found the estate office door standing open, and the desk inside, neat, empty, and entirely stripped. Every document was gone. Mrs. Ferris found her standing in the office doorway and understood from Marion's expression that something had gone badly wrong. When, Marion said, before first light, Miss, I heard a door and thought it was the kitchen maid. Mrs. Ferris's expression tightened into something harder. Mr. Vane was in the east corridor at 4, and I thought nothing of it. He often rises early. Does he? Marion walked to the desk. She opened the drawers one by one, methodically, because she already knew what she would find, and she needed to be certain. All of them empty. All except one. The locked drawer on the left side, which was still locked, which was locked because it required the small iron key currently sewn into the seam of her pocket, and Crispin Vane had not found it. She allowed herself exactly one breath of relief. Then she looked at Mrs. Ferris. I need you to send for Mr. Hadley, she said. Mr. Hadley was the duchy's trustee, who was already in the county on the matter of the review. Tell him his presence is required at Ashmore Hall this morning as a matter of duchy interest. Do not tell him anything else. And I need to speak to Thomas. Thomas was the estate's head groom, who had been at Ashmore Hall for 30 years, and who had, Marion suspected from certain oblique remarks he had made over 14 months, been watching Crispin Vane with the particular watchfulness of a person who has seen something they could not prove and has been waiting. And His Grace? Mrs. Ferris asked. Tell him, Marion said, that I accept his rejection. Tell him exactly those words. I accept your rejection, and I have something he needs to see. The Duke came in 40 minutes. In that 40 minutes, Marian located Thomas, who confirmed what she had suspected and agreed, in the economical way of men who have worked their whole lives in the same place and understand exactly what they owe it, to be present when she asked. She sent word to Mr. Hadley, who replied that he was already on the road, having had, he wrote in pencil at the bottom of the message, certain concerns of his own about the timing of this morning's events. She then sat in the kitchen, because it was warm, and because Cook pressed a second cup of tea into her hand and asked no questions, and she looked at the small iron key in her palm, and she thought about her father, who had told her once that the way out of any closed room is through the middle of it, in full light, with someone watching. The Duke's expression when he arrived at the kitchen door was not the expression of a man who had slept. "You told Mrs. Ferris you accepted my rejection," he said. Marian set down the cup. "I wanted your attention. You have it." She looked at him. He was standing in his own kitchen doorway in a good coat he had pulled on badly, and his hands were not still, and there was something in his face, not what she was expecting, not the careful judicial blankness, something that looked, around the edges, like a man who had made a decision and was not certain yet it had been the right one. She said, "I need the Great Hall. I need you, Thomas, and Mr. Hadley, who is on his way, and I need someone to find Crispin Vane and ask him, very civilly, to join us. Can you do those things?" "Yes," the Duke said. "Can you tell me in the hall?" she said. "In the light. With witnesses." Mr. Hadley arrived at 10:30, a neat, dry-voiced man of 60, with a magistrate's habit of sitting very still and taking everything in. Thomas was already in the hall, standing by the east window, with the expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and senses the patience is nearly spent. Mrs. Ferris had positioned herself near the door, with no particular excuse and no intention of leaving. Cook's kitchen maid had found a reason to polish something in the adjoining corridor. Crispin Vane came last. He came because the Duke had asked him in terms that admitted no graceful refusal, and because he had not yet determined what Marian could produce, and therefore could not calculate the precise angle of the risk. He came in beautifully composed, and he looked at the assembled room, and he looked at Marian, and he smiled. "Miss Voss," he said, in his gentlest voice, "I rather thought this morning might come to something of this kind." "Good," Marian said. "Then you've had time to prepare." She had one thing. Everything she had produced in 8 weeks of work was gone. He had made certain of that. She had this room, and the people in it, and the small iron key in her pocket, and whatever Thomas carried in his breast pocket, folded in oilcloth, which he had retrieved at first light from the feed-room on the grounds, precisely where she had told him to look when she had described it to him, and he had nodded once in the way of a man confirming a location he had already noted years before, and not known what to do with. She held out her hand to Thomas. He produced the packet from his breast pocket and gave it to her without ceremony. It was a letter, or rather, it was 2 letters, written on the same sheet in the same hand, one above the other, with a faint line between them where the page had been folded. The hand was Crispin Vane's. The upper letter was dated 4 years prior and addressed to a physician in a city that was 3 days' hard riding from Ashmore Hall, and it detailed, in careful, delicate language, a modification to Lady Ashmore's medicinal regimen, signed not in Vane's name, but in a close imitation of the Duke's own signature. The lower letter was dated 3 weeks later and was addressed to no one, and it was a private memo in a steward's shorthand that translated, when you knew the shorthand, as Marian knew the shorthand, because it was the same shorthand her father had used, and she had seen it in the domestic records and recognized it in 3 lines, into a careful accounting of what the modification had achieved and what it would mean for the management of the estate's finances in the years following. Below the shorthand, in a hand different from Vane's, were 4 words in pencil. Marian had not written them. She did not know who had. She suspected Thomas and had not asked. The 4 words were, "I saw him post it." She held the letter to the window light, the east window, where Thomas stood, where the morning was clear and cold and merciless, and she read the upper letter aloud. She read slowly and without inflection, the way her father had taught her to read documents that needed to speak for themselves. She did not look at the Duke. She looked at the letter. The hall was entirely silent by the time she finished. "Thomas," she said. "The physician who received this letter, did you know him?" "My sister's boy," Thomas said. He had the voice of a man choosing each word as though it weighed something. "A good doctor." "He didn't do it." He wrote back refusing, and the letter was intercepted before it arrived. He came to the hall himself, a week later, to speak to His Grace, and was turned away at the gate. By Mr. Vane. A pause. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to know what that meant." Marian looked at Crispin Vane. He was still smiling. It was, she thought, genuinely impressive. A man of lesser self-possession would have stopped smiling 4 minutes ago. "A forgery," he said, pleasantly, "clearly a forgery, and a clumsy one." "Anyone who examines it alongside a genuine sample of His Grace's signature will, Mr. Hadley," Marian said. The trustee, who had been sitting very still throughout, produced from his own breast pocket a folded document. It was a letter from the Duke of Ashmore, a genuine letter, bearing the seal of the duchy, dated 18 months prior. He laid it on the table beside the document from the letter. The room came in to look. The silence was of a different quality this time. "There is also," Marian said, "the matter of the accounts." She did not have her reconstruction. She did not need it. She had the 6 figures she had spent 14 hours committing to memory, and she had the ability to write them down in a column on a sheet of paper from Mr. Hadley's document case in under 3 minutes, annotated in the precise form her father had taught her, traceable to the domestic records in the East Store, the ones Vane had not removed because they were not labeled as accounts, and he had not known to look for them. "You will find," she said, setting the paper on the table beside the letters, "that these 6 figures represent money drawn against the household in the years following Lady Ashmore's change of regimen. They were entered in the ledgers as medical expenses. They are not. I can trace each of them to the domestic records in the East Store, which I am prepared to produce for your examination, Mr. Hadley, at whatever time you prefer. Each figure corresponds to the quarterly draw against a private account I found referenced in Mr. Vane's shorthand in those same records." Mr. Hadley looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at Crispin Vane. "Mr. Vane," he said, in the mild and impersonal voice of a man who has seen considerable wrongdoing and has reached the age of 60 without letting it make him theatrical, "I will need those private accounts. I will need them this afternoon. I will also need you to remain on the premises until this matter is formally reviewed, and I would ask you very kindly not to visit the estate office, the document store, or the stables in the interim." And there it was. Not the conclusion yet. The formal conclusion would be the trustees to reach, in the correct time, in the correct manner, but the hairline fracture in Crispin Vane's beautiful composure, the first visible fissure in the porcelain, and it was produced not by accusation or by theater, but by one mild old man asking a reasonable administrative question in a reasonable administrative voice. Vane looked, for the first and only time in the proceeding, directly at Marian. She waited. "There was going to be nothing for me," he said, and his voice had dropped its careful pleasantness, not into anger, not into threat, but into something else, something that she recognized with faint and terrible surprise as grief. He had the title, the estate, the duchy's support. I had managed it for years, kept it running when he was absent, when his aunt was dying, when there was no one else. I was always second. I was always the one who did the work that bore someone else's name. He stopped. The beautiful face was still beautiful. It was merely, suddenly, exhausted. I did not think she would die. The dosage was meant to. I thought it would be manageable. I thought. He did not finish the sentence. He pressed his mouth closed, and he looked at the floor, and he was, in that moment, not immaculate at all. He was simply a man of 34 who had made a calculation about a human life and had been wrong and had lived with it for 4 years in a house full of the evidence, and Marian, who had every reason in the world to be glad of his destruction, felt the hatred she had been carrying for 3 days shift into something she did not have a precise name for, which was pity, and was worse. The Duke spoke. He had not spoken since she began. He stood at the far side of the hall, with his hands still at his sides, and his face the careful, impenetrable surface he offered the world when the world was requiring too much of him. And he said, "Get out." Not violent, not loud. Quieter, if anything, than his usual quiet. "His Grace," Marian said. And she did not know, entirely, why she said it, only that the grief on Crispin Vane's face was real, and that it did not excuse what he had done, but that it was real, and she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her that a person who destroys what they cannot have is not the same as a person who destroys for the love of destroying, and that the distinction matters. Mr. Hadley, I would ask that Mr. Vane's family circumstances be considered before any public action is taken. He has a mother in reduced circumstances, and there are ways to resolve the financial matter that do not require. Miss Voss. Mr. Hadley looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing something. You are asking me to handle this quietly. I am asking you to handle it correctly. The two things are not, she said, with a faint shadow of the correction she had offered the Duke on her first morning in his study, the same. The trustee considered this. Then he nodded once, the small, deliberate nod of a man who has reached a determination. Quietly, he said, and thoroughly. Mr. Vane, I will expect you in the library at 2 o'clock. You will bring the accounts. You will not bring an attorney, because I think we will find we can resolve this without requiring one, so long as you are cooperative. A pause. Go and have something to eat. You look as though you haven't slept. Crispin Vane looked at Mr. Hadley. He looked at Thomas, who met his gaze without expression. He did not look again at Marian or at the Duke. He nodded once and left, and the door to the west corridor closed behind him, and the room released a collective breath that no one had been aware they were holding. Mrs. Ferris was weeping. She appeared entirely mortified about it and was pressing her handkerchief against her mouth with the ferocity of a woman punishing her own feelings, and Thomas had put his arm around her shoulders in the way of a man who has been working beside someone for 30 years and considers this fully within his authority. Right, said Thomas, in the voice of a man resuming normal operations. There's a kitchen to run, and horses to see to, and I should think somebody wants tea. He steered Mrs. Ferris toward the door, and cook's kitchen maid vanished from the corridor, and Mr. Hadley gathered his documents with the unhurried care of a man who understands that other people's pivotal moments deserve some privacy and departs accordingly. And then there was no one in the great hall of Ashmore House but Marian Voss and the Duke, and the morning light coming through the east window, and somewhere above them a house martin beginning its business in the eaves with a complete indifference to everything that had just occurred. The Duke looked at her for a long time. She realized, very tired. "You knew last week," he said. "I suspected last week. I knew the morning the documents disappeared. The letter in the locked drawer. You found it weeks ago. Yes, why did you not? Because a single document proved by a single witness is an accusation. What I needed was a demonstration." She looked at the table, at the two letters lying side by side in the morning light. You needed to see it in a room where the seeing could not be argued with afterward. "I told you," he said, "that Vane's account of you was not implausible." You were right. Something moved across his face at that. Not the small recalibration she had seen in the study on the first morning. Something larger. Something that was costing him more than he wanted it to cost him. He crossed the room. He stopped 3 feet from her, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the letter, carefully, without hurrying, as though she were a document he was trying to read correctly this time. "I did not believe him," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I told you his account was not implausible because I thought." He stopped. She watched him make the decision to be honest, and disliked him less for the fact that it was visibly a decision. "I was frightened," he said, "not of you, of what you had found. I have been managing this estate from a distance for 6 years, and you sat in that office for 8 weeks and saw what I had not permitted myself to see, and I handled that very badly." Marian said, "Yes." A beat. His mouth curved. It was, she thought, the 3rd time she had seen his mouth curve in something approaching a real expression, and all 3 times had been in the past 8 weeks. The first had been at something she said about crop rotation. The second had been late in the evening over the accounts. This one was different. This one reached his eyes. "You are not going to make this easy for me," he said. "No, should I?" "No," he said. "You shouldn't." He looked at her hands. The locked drawer. She produced the small iron key from the seam of her pocket and set it on the table between them. He looked at it. It needed doing, she said, which was what she had told him on the first morning, and something passed between them at the repetition of it, a recognition, a line handed back transformed. He picked up the key. "Miss Voss," he said, and his voice was quiet in a different register from all its previous quietnesses, not the dangerous quiet, not the careful judicial quiet, but something she did not have a word for in the vocabulary of a person who had spent 4 years keeping still. "I owe you a salary for 14 months. I owe you an apology for yesterday. And I owe you," he stopped. She could see him choosing the words with the same care he brought to everything. "I owe you an explanation of why I have been absent from this estate, of my aunt, of the grief that has made me. I have been told I am not easy to work for. I have managed," she said. "You have managed magnificently. That is not the same thing." He turned the key in his fingers. "I had a letter from my aunt a week before she died, as it turned out, though I did not receive it until after. She wrote she had a theory about the cause of her decline that at the time I thought was the writing of a woman who was unwell and frightened. I did not investigate. I told myself I could not investigate without I had no evidence. I had a sick woman's fear. And I chose not to look." A pause. "I think I have been choosing not to look for 4 years." Marian was very still. "Crispin Vane," he said, "has been with this estate since I was 22. He knew my father. He was the first person who—" He stopped again. "Grief," he said, more quietly, "is its own kind of blindness." She understood. She was the daughter of a man who had trusted the wrong person and lost everything, his practice, his house, his reputation, his health in the final winter of it. And she had watched him choose not to look for years before the blindness became permanent. She said, "The letter your aunt wrote to you. Do you still have it?" He looked at her. "Yes, keep it," she said. "Keep it somewhere safe. When the trustees' review is concluded and the accounts are clean, write back to her physician's family. He deserved to know his warning was received. Something in him settled." She could see it, the particular settling of a weight that has been carried wrong for too long, shifted at last onto both shoulders instead of one. "My aunt wrote something else," he said. At the end of the letter, she said there was a woman in the hall, a young woman, she said, who read to her in the mornings, who had her late father's way of watching people and knowing what they meant by their hands. She said, "Keep her, Edmund. She is worth more than all the rest of this put together." Marian said nothing. The house martin went on in the eaves. The light moved on the floor. "I have a great deal to repair," the Duke said. "In this house, with this estate. And I should like," he looked at the key, then at her, "I should like very much, Miss Voss, if you would help me do it, in whatever capacity seems honest to you, whatever terms seem just to you. I am done deciding what other people can afford to know." She looked at him for a long time. "You should be aware," she said finally, "that I intend to ask for the title I have been doing without, the wage commensurate with it, and the lock changed on that estate desk drawer so that the key is mine and not kept in a seam. Done, and I will not be managed." "I had," he said, with the curve again, deeper this time and entirely genuine, rather noticed. She held out her hand. He took it and shook it, which was not what she had intended, and not what either of them expected, and was somehow exactly right. A contract, plainly struck, between two people who understood the vocabulary of ledgers and had begun, very slowly, to learn a different one. "Then we have a review in 10 days, she said, "and an estate office to rebuild, and I suggest we begin." They began. The trustees' review, when it came, was thorough and produced no surprises for anyone who had spent the previous 10 days in that estate office. Mr. Hadley presented his findings to the Duchy Board in a document of 47 pages, the first 17 of which had been drafted, in part, from Marian's reconstruction, which she had produced again from memory. In 3 days, more cleanly than the first, and the remaining 30 from the private accounts that Crispin Vane had surrendered in the library on that first afternoon, with the resignation of a man who has run out of alternative calculations. The board restored the estate's standing, commended the trustees' handling, and recorded no formal charges against any named party, a discretion that Marian had negotiated through Mr. Hadley in exchange for full cooperation and the return of the drawn funds in installments over 7 years, to be managed by Vane's mother's estate in county. The physician's family received a letter from the Duke, written in his own hand, and a settlement that required no public explanation and asked for none. Crispin Vane left Ashmore Hall on a Wednesday morning in late summer, with a trunk and 2 portmanteaus and no ceremony. He paused at the door of the great hall, and he looked back, and Marian, who happened to be crossing the hall at that moment with a new ledger under her arm, met his gaze. He had the look of a man who has been stripped of his immaculateness and has discovered, to his own apparent surprise, that the self underneath it is not what he feared. She nodded to him. Once, he nodded back. He left. Thomas declared this outcome so unsatisfying as to be nearly offensive, and said so at dinner to Mrs. Ferris, who told him that justice and satisfaction were not always the same thing, and that if he was waiting for them to coincide, he would die of old age in this kitchen, and he said he supposed there were worse fates, and she agreed there were. And they had a glass of port, which was not their usual habit, and went to bed. The estate ledgers, once the reconstruction was complete, showed a discrepancy of 9 years compound interest in the household's favor, an accounting error made long before Vane's tenure, which Marian had found in the third of the brown boxes, and which yielded, once corrected, sufficient surplus to repair the east wing's roof, replace the ill-fitted window in the estate office, and purchase a new ledger with a brass clasp that did not grow cold through wool. The Duke had the old one rebound and kept it on the shelf above the desk. On the 31st of October, autumn proper now, the moor going red and bronze, the mornings sharp and brief, he came to the estate office in the early evening when the work was done, and he stood in the doorway, and he said her name. Not Miss Voss. Her name, which he had known for 4 years and used for the first time the week after the tribunal, and which he used with the particular care of a man handling something he does not want to break. She turned. "There is a question," he said, "that I have been trying to find the honest way to ask for several weeks." She set down her pen. "I want to be clear," he said, "that the estate's accounts are in order, that the Duchy's review is complete, that your position here is secure and would remain so regardless of your answer. I want to be very clear that I am not asking because you did something remarkable, and I am grateful, though you did, and I am." He crossed the room. He stopped 2 feet from her. "I want you to understand that what I am about to say has nothing to do with any of that." "Say it then," she said. He looked at her hands, and then at her face, and she thought of all the mornings she had been invisible in this house, all the doorways she had carried ledgers through and not been seen, all the times she had made herself small and still and useful and unremarkable. And she thought she was done with that. She had been done with it since the 12th of June, in the great hall, in the light, with witnesses. "Marry me," he said, "because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." She was quiet for a long moment. "You laughed for the first time in October," she said, "over the matter of the tenant accounts and the goat." He blinked. "I remember. I knew then," she said. "I thought a man who laughs like that, surprised at himself, as though he had forgotten laughter was available to him, I thought that was a man I should like to know better. And do you?" His voice had gone quiet in its new register. "Know me better." "Well enough," she said, "to say yes." The wedding was small. It was performed in the village church on the first Saturday of November by the local rector, who was 91 and missed 3 lines of the service and did not notice, and witnessed by Thomas, Mrs. Ferris, Mrs. Hadley, cook, and the kitchen maid, who had invited herself and no one had thought to uninvite. Thomas wept, which he had predicted he would not do, and which Marian had predicted he would, and Mrs. Ferris told him this was deeply undignified and wept herself, and cook produced a cold ham and a currant cake from somewhere, and the reception was held in the kitchen, which seemed right. Mr. Hadley gave a toast that consisted of 4 words and was entirely sufficient. The Duke held Marian's hand through all of it and did not manage his expression once, and she thought she had never seen him look more like himself. The physician's nephew, Thomas's sister's boy, who had driven 3 hours to be present at the wedding, stood in the corner of the kitchen with a cup of something warm and told Mrs. Ferris about his practice in the city, and she told him about her niece who had recently come to live nearby, and he asked if he might be given her direction, and she said she supposed she could arrange it, and they did. Marian's mother's jet brooch, the one she had worn on the morning of the tribunal, was reset into a pin and given to Mrs. Ferris at Christmas, which caused a second occurrence of the October incident in the kitchen corridor, and was warmly approved by everyone present. The redeemable rival, who was not a person but was rather the Board of Trustees' initial skepticism of Marian's findings, was dispatched by the time the second quarterly review came round and replaced by a formal appointment and a letter of commendation that she folded and placed, without ceremony, in the drawer that was now entirely her own. The following July, near a year since the 12th of June, Marian was crossing the great hall with a ledger under her arm when she heard, through the drawing-room door, the voice of the estate's new steward briefing two of the house's younger staff on some domestic matter. She paused. She listened. The voices were entirely ordinary. The matter was entirely ordinary. No one was saying anything about chandeliers or hallboys or the relative usefulness of anyone. She shifted the ledger under her arm and went on across the hall. Her husband was in the study. He looked up when she came in. He always looked up when she came in, which she had noted and which she did not take for granted and did not intend to. She set the ledger on the desk. She looked at the window, where the July light came through clean and even, and she thought of the morning she had stood in this room for the first time, with the accounts pressed flat against her chest, and he had looked at them the way a man looks at ground he had assumed was solid. "The new ledger year is clean," she said. He looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. "It usually is," he said, "when you have been in here with it." Outside, somewhere above the east eaves, the house martin went on with its summer business, indifferent as ever to the settled, carefully tended happiness of the room below. The July light held. The accounts were clean. And if she had once stood in a doorway in a house that did not see her, choosing the stairwell, keeping still, making herself small, well, the ledger was hers now. The room was hers, the window let in the right light. And some debts, when they are finally paid in full, leave the ledger not empty, but clear. If this story warmed you, if you have ever been the one who did the work that bore someone else's name and waited for the room to finally see you, then you know the particular quiet joy of this ending, and I am glad we sat with it together. There is always a place here, by this fire, for a story honestly told. Pull up a chair. The kettle is on, and there are more of these waiting for you, slow burn and true, the kind that costs something and gives something back. Tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew? The ledger and the light, or was it the laugh, the one that surprised him? Come and find us if this is the kind of story you want beside you on a long evening. We keep the lamp lit here, and we are glad when you stay. Sleep well and be steady with the ones who see you clearly.